Welcome everybody to OBIC's Open Banking Insight Series. I'm your host, Michelle Beyo, CEO of Finavator, as well as an OBIC board member. I'm really excited to be here today because we're going to be talking about a really passionate topic, which is digital ID and how open banking can highlight the importance of the use of digital ID, both in Canada as well as the UK, and how important it is for fintechs, FIs, and consumers. In today's discussion, we're really going to talk about how digital ID can help make access to new services safer and more secure, and helping Canadians move away from the current screen scraping tools that are being utilized and giving them better control of their data. Because we have now hit over 4 million Canadians using screen scraping. As we start today's episode, I'm really excited to introduce our distinguished moderator of the entire series, Senator Colin Deacon. He is an independent senator for Nova Scotia, as well as has a very unique background as an entrepreneur. He is very well focused on ensuring Canadians get access to their data, as well as drive innovation for Canadians. Thank you so much for being here, Senator.
Glad to be here.
And I'm very happy to introduce Kashmera. She's the AVP of Strategy and Emerging Solution Delivery at Interac. She's responsible for determining the role Interac plays within Canada's innovation ecosystem, as well as she leads the evolution of opportunities of the emerging trends and technologies within Canada. Thank you so much for being here, Kash.
Hey, Michelle. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here.
And very excited as well to have the UK expert, as well as a very passionate speaker, David Birch. He is an author, an advisor, a commentary on digital financial services, a top 10 most influential voice in banking by financial brands. So excited to have you here, David.
Thank you, Michelle.
So as we kick off today's session, I would like to have Colin Deacon please share with us his thoughts on how important digital ID is for open banking.
You know, I definitely could offer my thoughts, but I think what's most important, Michelle, is that we get into the conversation as quickly as possible because, you know, I've heard Kash speak and I've seen a TEDx that Dave Birch was that did, and I just want to get right into that. So with your permission, I'm going to dive right into the questions because this is a topic that I think is so important. And I'm really glad to have these two global experts on the panel today. So Kash, just give us some background on Interac and your role and the thoughts about the current challenges and the big opportunity of open banking for Canadians before we dive into the specific topic of digital ID.
Sure. So our role for a very long time now has been around being that convener within the financial services industry, specifically, payments and digital information exchange. And we've been doing it for a very long time. We've done this in traditional payments, we've done this in mobile payments, and now we're doing it more broadly and specifically within digital ID and open banking. To touch on the challenges, well, consumers are really experimenting with digital solutions more so now than ever before. We're seeing this in an increased acceleration in the use of, yes, the Interac solutions. And I think more importantly, it's not just Interac, it's actually within the broader industry. Whether you're a traditional FI, whether you're a challenger bank or a fintech, all of these organizations are providing new digital offerings to meet customer need. But, big but, with increased digital adoption and experimentation, there is also now consumer distrust, and more so now than ever before. A few data points. Over 6 in 10 Canadians care more now about keeping their identity data safe online, and this was more so than they did in the past. And consumers want to feel in control of their financial information, and this was to the tune of about 94% of respondents based on primary research that we had conducted earlier in the year. So that's probably one of the first things. The second is, Michelle touched on it. Yes, there's screen scraping, and yes, it helps meet an immediate need, but it comes with risk, and risk, quite frankly, that most consumers don't know or understand that's even happening. And then the third is that current economic climate, there is increased pressure on existing models, and small to medium businesses, they were simply not ready for that shift to moving to digital, which happened really overnight. If I were going to talk about the opportunities, and I'll start high level because we've got a little bit of time here today, The DOF round 2 consultations have kicked off. And in plain language, the advisory committee stated 2 things. Open banking stands to promote 1, economic growth, and 2, consumer welfare for all Canadians and for all of Canada. Period. Full stop. But the question now is, how do we actually make all of this happen? How do we put the customer at the center of it all?
Yep.
How we foster that trust in the consumer, and not just in the consumer, but quite frankly, trust across all ecosystem participants. Whether you're a big bank, whether you're a fintech, how do we make sure that we grow this opportunity and for all, as opposed to people looking at it in this very antiquated way of there being potentially winners and losers? So that's what I would outline as like potential challenges, but also the significant opportunity that's ahead of us.
I love that. I love that picture. And I also love the picture of it being antiquated about the world just being about winners and losers, because I broadening access to opportunity is where we need focus. So I love that. The other thing is focus on digital identity and control. I've said that there's over on one side, you've got the conspiracy theorists who want to wear tinfoil hats and protect themselves from the thoughts being stolen. And on the other side, there's teenagers who seem to put everything online and wrap themselves in saran wrap. That's about as much protection as they provide. We've got to find that balance in the middle that allows Canadians to control their data, who uses what data for what purposes for how long. And that to me is such an exciting future that we have in front of us. So I mean, well stated all around. Dave Birch, I'm really glad to get a chance to get to know you and get some of your thoughts from the UK perspective. You've got a head start on us in Canada for sure on all these issues, and you've been deeply involved in so many of them. I understand that you're doing a project right now with the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum in the UK around digital identity, but I also just generally, if you could just start off with some of the current challenges and opportunities gained from open banking in the UK. You've got some time on the road there. You know what it's like. So just give us some of the lessons learned or opportunities created.
I might throw it into relief, Colin, by saying that it's certainly true that we have something to offer. I mean, but what we have to offer is often more valuable in terms of what not to do, because we had a go at it first. And I think in this case, there are sort of 3 strands coming together here, where the UK has some worthwhile lessons, particularly for the Canadian market. So on the one hand, we were very early into faster payments, and we've got a great deal of experience in that now. And one of the primary uses of open banking will be to get access to immediate payments. And because we were early in, we opted to build it on the old infrastructure rather than the new infrastructure that Payments Canada is putting together. So one thing to learn from there is we didn't get all of the value added opportunities that might be open to you because we didn't use the right. By the way, I'm not saying this is a negative thing. We did this years ago. Now everybody's building on 222. It's all different. But nonetheless, Canada has an opportunity to look at some more value added infrastructure than we did at the time, which means that you'll be presenting things like request to pay and so on as overlay services on top of that infrastructure, which we didn't have. The second thing is open banking. We were the first with the sort of mandated regulatory open banking infrastructure, and it hasn't set the world on fire. I mean, it's works okay. It hasn't transformed the lives of consumers. And we'll come back to why in a minute, but the point is, I think you wouldn't start from where we are on the open banking side of things. And one particular part of that is digital identity, because when you're doing the sort of whiteboard discussion about what are the cool things you can do with open banking, you see people talk about, well, I'll give my car permission to access my bank account to pay for the parking space, and I'll use my bank will prove that I'm over 18 and I live in Canada and all this sort of. And all of those things sound great when you draw them on the whiteboard, but when you drop down one level, there's absolutely nothing there here. And I'm not saying that I understand why decisions were made and they were made in good faith, but I think if you spoke to a lot of people in the open banking world here now, they would say that in retrospect, it would have been better to have done something about digital identity at the time and gone, because what you have at the moment is you have the instant credit networks building their own directory infrastructure, open banking build its own directory infrastructure, and it doesn't really make any sense. And it would be much better to have a proper digital identity infrastructure that everybody could use. But and in the open banking context, that's not just digital identity for people. That's digital identity for companies as well. And if you look at the, I mean, just to pick on one kind of use case, government support for individuals and businesses through the pandemic has been subject to absolutely colossal fraud here. I mean, the Treasury estimates, not my estimates, but I mean, the government's own estimates are that they're looking to lose something in the region of 40 to 50 billion pounds in fraud, because nobody knows who anybody is. So who has access to these bank accounts, whether it's my bank account, whether 15 megabytes is a real company. By the way, I should say, for that, we believe in adding to the greater gaiety of the nations. So in the UK, the company register, if you're going to register as a director and executive officer of a company, you don't even have to be a real person. They don't even check if you're a real person. Right. So it's no wonder that the whole thing. So you say on the one hand, well, it's amazing. We have this faster payments infrastructure. We have open banking. We can get government support to people right away, right when they need it. The money's going so it's not just about the digital identity of people. It's about the digital identity of everything. Like, how do I know? I mean, half the time we spend talking about digital identity, and I've been around a whiteboard with Cash doing that. Half the time we're talking about digital identity, we're talking about, well, how can I log on to the bank easily? How can I log on to the government easily? How can I log on to federal, easily? But the other half of the problem, which is how the hell do I know that your Royal Bank of Canada is nowhere near being solved? And this is why people are being cleaned out by these fraudsters who are sending them text messages. Hello, this is your bank. There's a problem with your account, and so on. So we should have tackled this problem, and we didn't. And to me, one of the biggest and most important lessons in Canada is that certainly from the Interac perspective, is you guys are taking this seriously, and you're dealing with the identity problem as well as the open banking problem. So I guess if you're talking about learning, that I suppose that's my key message.
And I think that's really the great opportunity that Canada has right now, is being a fast follower, learning from, we've always been learning from the Brits and making sure that we don't make their mistakes. I mean,
what? Did you accidentally invade Suez or something? I don't remember that.
Listen, Cash, I want you to focus in on, I mean, we are where we are as a society that's digitizing far more rapidly than many of our institutions. So that's the reality of the world we're in today. One of the things that I wonder about is what is the question as to whether or not digital identity is essential to our moving forward in open banking in Canada, or if we build for it, but use it, as we get adoption growing across the country, whether or not it's an accelerant as we move forward. So can you just sort of spend some time giving us insights on that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because yes, we have the luxury and the opportunity to take all the learnings from all these other jurisdictions. Absolutely. That's totally what we're going to do. We're going to take away what has worked in other jurisdictions, what has not worked in other jurisdictions. Having said that, in Canada, we look at things a little differently. David touched on payments initiation through third parties. That has been underway for quite a heck of a long time here in Canada and is well underway. Then we have digital ID, again, separate work stream here in Canada, well underway. And now we've got this third one, and it seems like COVID has really put the accelerant on top of that, is around open banking, and it's moving independently as well. And, I think it would be ideal if there was a digital ID solution that was trusted and accepted by all and available today, and it had reached critical mass, and it would be easy peasy for us to take that and apply it or leverage it in an open banking context. The challenge is it hasn't reached critical mass yet. It's well underway, but it hasn't yet. So does that mean, as a nation, should we put the brakes on open banking? Yeah. Should we put the brakes on all the other things that will really transform our economy? Should we do that? Probably not so much. Digital ID and open banking, they rely on consumer trust to function effectively. If there's trust in the system, it'll drive consumer adoption. And that would impact competition, it would impact innovation, and it will ultimately be good for the economy. A basic tenet of this trust should be that the consumer understands how their data is being used. And I'm also talking about small to medium businesses here, David. And they need to understand this during the consent granting process. And they need to know how that data is being used. If we get all of it right, and what I'm saying is let those three streams move, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that we need to, at some point, they will all come together. They will intersect. And getting that right now will make sure that we're well on our way to ensuring the framework works for all and is inclusive to all.
And I think that's a really good summary, Kash, because what I hate is the idea that these things have to move in series, one after the other, versus in parallel, because we don't, the global competitive environment is such where we can't afford to not move in parallel and be informing back and forth as to how we can ultimately come together. So that's a great summary from my standpoint. All of this has been accelerated by the pandemic. The digitization in the world, and David, you went into a number of the sort of risk factors that are there for governments when some of the controls are not in place. What is from your standpoint, the pressure that's been put on UK businesses and financial institutions and fintechs that a digital ID infrastructure can help to alleviate?
Well, I mean, first of all, bear in mind, we have no infrastructure. So we don't have any kind of digital identity infrastructure here. We had a government identity infrastructure, which worked so poorly, it was essentially abandoned at the start of the COVID crisis when people needed to suddenly access government services they haven't accessed before. It just really didn't work. We're planning a more framework-based approach in the new year, which is basically a good idea. I mean, but you already have Canadian Trust Framework. You already know how a framework should look. I don't think we have anything to show you from there. What I would say about the government side of it through the crisis is I think it's shown what the business case, the question that was quite often hard to answer, and I'm sure, well, I know perfectly well that Michelle and Kash have tackled this same issue, is trying to construct the business case for digital identity. So people will say to you, well, okay, how much should we spend on it? What's the business case going to look like? There's always someone from some management consultancy or other sitting around the table and, well, what's the 5-year revenue breakdown? If I knew, I certainly wouldn't be telling you. I'd start a company to do it, But the negative business case, we now know what it costs us not to have a digital identity infrastructure, and that's given us some bounds going forward about the kind of thing that we should be doing. And I suspect that it has some spillover implications into some other sectors, because we're primarily talking about or at least I'm primarily talking about the financial sector and the financial use of open banking data. But of course, one thing that we learned very quickly through the pandemic was that people who never had to think about this stuff before suddenly did. I mean, all of a sudden, you've got people in education and health and all sorts of other sectors who now have to work online when they never had to before. And all of a sudden, that open banking data suddenly takes on a slightly different context here. So, because suppose I'm logging on to some kind of education site or whatever. I mean, one obvious and straightforward way of proving that I'm a person and that I actually exist would be to log into my open banking and have the bank provide some sort of cryptographic token or something which goes back. So the spillover into these other areas, I think, is going to be just as important. And so what we'll likely see, and again, I don't want to make ridiculous predictions, but because Canada has opted for this more framework-based approach, which is the right approach, I think what we might see, and taking on board Kash's point about things moving at different speeds, is what we might see is a sort of financial services passport a health passport, an education passport, a travel pass, because you have a framework when they can interoperate. So what we might see is those moving along at different speeds to serve sort of different needs. I mean, certainly you don't want to lock these all together. I take that point on board completely. What I would say about the open banking stuff also, though, Colin, is I think one thing we did learn in the UK was that it doesn't take that much open banking data to make a pretty substantial difference to some of the businesses involved. So in other words, if I can get access to your, let's say, whether I'm trying to assess you for an education grant, or I'm trying to see if you're a real person for a health purposes, or I'm trying to see for any of these things, it doesn't actually need that much data. If I can get into your bank account and just get the little bit of data that I need, you can get tremendous leverage off that. That's especially true in the SME sector. And coming out of the pandemic, we really need energy in the SME sector. Those guys have been hit really pretty badly. And what we've taken, I don't know what the word for it there is, we call it data-driven liquidity. SMEs are notoriously bad users of financial services. They don't understand the range of options available to them. They tend to fund on credit cards and overdrafts and things like that. If I can get into your SME bank account, and if I can just get a few weeks worth of data, I can almost instantly provide better. It doesn't take giant robo supercomputers, a bit of ML, a bit of AI, and I can. So I think these kind of areas, can generate some pretty good returns for a relatively small investment. So yes, I take on board that point about the different sectors moving at different speeds. If I was going to prioritize, I tend to be looking into kind of the SME space, because that's the engine we need to get the economy moving.
Couldn't agree more. And I love the phrase data-driven liquidity.
Oh, I didn't invent
it. For me, you have. It's it sums up a very important thought, Dave. And after incomes and assets have been pummeled through this pandemic, that phrase and that concept is increasingly important. I couldn't agree more. Great framing. So, Cash, let's come up with the perfect framework, the roadmap for moving forward in Canada and helping Canada to catch up. How does read and write functionality fit in? How do we, you're in charge now. Tell us how to do it.
Right. I'm going to touch a little bit, and you would think David was part of the Department of Finance consultations with the many of the points that he's just touched on.
Absolutely.
Either that, or he's got, his finger on the pulse of what's happening. Regardless, we're all on the same page. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. I'm like, we're talking about it in the context of open banking. We're talking about it in the context of how do we actually support small to medium businesses. I'm going to actually take it back to payments, and then I'll bring it forward again. Okay.
Love it.
The first one is around, we know that individual consumers are decreasing their cash use and opting for a wide option of digital payments. We've seen this, there were some 2018 stats where cash represented 21% of transactions in Canada, and that was down 40% in 2013, big drop, okay? And then businesses are becoming more interested in digital payments. They are looking at what's more convenient, and they're looking for things to be processed in real time. A nod to you here, David. Central banks are also now recognizing this decreasing use of cash, and are seeking a potential alternative for consumers and businesses. So big nod there. So we see what's happening. But then if you think about this in the context of open banking and consent and through digital ID, what does this all mean? Well, we talk about cash, we talk about cashless, but aren't we really just talking about value? And it may not be, immediately clear, but our decreasing use of cash is really leading us to an open finance future. And the shift that is happening from traditional payments to non-traditional payments to open banking to open finance, and ultimately to open data, there's definitely a trend that's happening. And ultimately, we're talking about different organizations here, public sector, private sector, all of us being custodians of an individual's data, and we're kind of dictating what happens, but based on customer consent. And if I were to then take it one step further, are we all going to just let this stuff happen where the problems will kind of unfold? And are there not going to be unintended consequences when we just make that, stand by and see what happens? And is it not actually the onus of all of us and a combination of what is happening from a market perspective, what is happening from a government perspective, to ensure that actually no one is left behind? I'm not Canadian by birth, but I feel a compelling reason to like inform and influence how all of this unfolds. And like, is that not like the premise of like civilized society? I've taken this on a whole other tangent, I realize that, but is that not what we're trying to accomplish here? And then if you make it more tangible.
Well,
Listen, that was just, no, but I want to capture that moment, because that is exactly where we're at in this country right now. If we do not get actively engaged and embrace the reality of this, we're riding a wave that we can choose to ignore or not, but it's happening, and our economy and our society is being pulled along. And the key is, do we want to get in a position where we are controlling it for the benefit of Canadians, or it's happening to Canadians? Very simply. David, sorry, you were going to interject.
No, I was going to say that that Kash's point is that so the relationship between identity and money in that sense is really quite straightforward. And I'll give you a very simple example, which is, you know, you used to go to the pub and you'd buy a drink and then give the guy some money. Now you go to the pub, you scan a QR code, you order your drinks. When you're finished, you get up and walk out. It's a much better user experience. Why you'll go back to doing it the old way? I mean, we've been pushed into it by the virus, but we're not going to go back to doing it the old way. Why? Well, because under the new way, the pub knows who I am. So when I go in and scan the QR code, I'm checking in, not checking out like I used to. Okay. So now you know who I am, but because you know who I am, you can deliver me a much better service, a much better customer experience. You can send me your special offers, and I mean, whatever it is you want to do. But the point is, you know who I am, and I don't have to wait for the bill at the end because I just get up and walk out. So by knowing who I am, you generate a much better user experience, which doesn't involve cash. And that makes me think of two things in response to Kash's point. So the first is, which goes back to your point at the beginning, which is, if that's going to be the way of doing things, and I think it's a better way of doing things, you can't do it absent some basic decisions about privacy, and which is, as you pointed out, is completely to do with control. And we haven't quite figured that out yet. And I think it takes, I would certainly favor a solution which takes responsible intermediaries, e.g. banks, for example, to sit in there and look after my personal data and keep it away from people who don't need it.
Sorry, but then I think what you're suggesting is that we employ like a privacy by design type of framework and look at it up front as opposed to an afterthought.
That would be
deal with the consequences of it and do it across the three, you know, across a digital ID and an open banking, because at some point they will come together. Yeah,
absolutely. And, you know, I mean, obviously I see that from a more technological perspective, but I think we've come to the same conclusion from different perspectives on that. So no, I agree completely. But the second point about cash, I think, is really difficult to deal with, because in countries that have not had a national strategy towards this, Sweden is the example everybody uses, going cashless sort of by accident has had those negative. So the point you're making, if you just let things slide into cashlessness, you end up with some people being marginalized and excluded, and that's not the best solution for the kind of society that we want. So that means we have to have a national strategy towards cashlessness, and it's not obvious to me that we're really quite ready for that yet. Because you see, the thing is that it isn't to do necessarily, you know, at the moment we're letting that strategy be formed by default. Mm-hmm. Because we're just letting people go ahead, and so if we're going to have that strategy, who should be involved in that strategy? It has to be economists, anthropologists, sociologists. You know, it has to be. So in other words, people like that should be kind of setting the dials, and then telling technologists like me and businesses like you to implement wherever they've set that. You know, we shouldn't be setting those dials. They should be setting those dials. And I can't resist the mischief of pointing out the odd role of central banks in all of this, because you're quite right to say that the use of cash has been collapsing. It has in the UK, just as it has in Canada. For obscure reasons, I was looking at the Australian figures earlier on today for a different project that I'm involved in. Same things happened there. The use of cash at retail point of sale has collapsed. However, the amount of cash in circulation has continued to climb, to the point where in the UK last week, the parliamentary committee has upbraided the Bank of England and challenged the Bank of England to explain where all the missing cash is, because there's billions, primarily in high value notes, which I mean, if you take the UK 50, I couldn't even tell you what a £50 note looks like. You could give me anything and tell me it's a £50 note. I wouldn't know any different. I couldn't tell you the last time I even saw a £50 note. And there are billions in circulation. And the same is true for high value notes in Canada. In the US, there are more $100 bills in circulation than $1 bills. And you cannot persuade me that those are being used for transactional purposes by people who are excluded from the formal financial economy. Those are being used for money laundering, drug dealing, tax evasion. So we have to come up with a much more reasoned. So on the one hand, you could say, well, why are we producing banknotes purely to subsidize the criminal fraternity? No normal people need them. When was the last time you ever used a banknote for anything? I mean, I'm not saying anything about you, but I do understand demographics, and I can tell from here that you're a debit user, right? So the last time, when was the last time you even saw cash, let alone used it for anything? But if you just take the cash away, you hit those marginalized communities, and we don't want that. So you can either sort of do what the UK did with the access to cash review last year, which is fudge the whole issue and basically try and come up with some ways of trying to subsidize cash at the expense of everybody else. Or you could do what I would imagine to be a much more Canadian, more innovative and forward-looking solution, and say, well, what should we do instead? What should we provide those communities? What should we deliver to those people? Given that we live in a world where people have invented transistors and laser beams and all this sort of thing, why are we printing $100 bills? It's insane. So I absolutely agree with you about the need to have this bigger picture. And I certainly have some ideas about inputs to that picture. But I don't think people like me are the right people to shape that debate. It's a political, economic, social debate. It's not a technology debate.
Dave, Birch, I just love, I mean, we've just had a couple of segments here that are, for me, just fabulous, because it reinforces where the world's moving, what the reality is. I mean, there's estimates that the amount of our AML activities globally are capturing less than 1% of illicit fund transfers around the world, of criminal activity.
Well, I don't know the Europol figure. The head of Europol said a little while ago that they estimated that I mean, this is the colossal expenditure, right? They are spending billions of dollars on this, and basically they reckon they were intercepting 0.15% of the fraudulent flows.
Yeah.
And you said you have a business career behind you. If one of your people came to you and said, all that money we spent has delivered a return of 0.15, you'd fire them. You wouldn't say that's in there. You'd just fire them. That would be end of. You know,
you look at the open finance and reg tech opportunities. That's one of the ones I'd love Canada to become a global leader on. Why would we not want to be the global leaders in creating an industry that actually succeeds at AML activities? But there we go. That's it. So it's even worse than I thought.
Let me show you. I'll tell you just the status of AML in this country, which is one of the companies I'm a director for. Applied for a pandemic support loan, which in the end they didn't need, but as it was prudent to apply for it. In order to do that, the bank, where I've had an account for 44 years, the bank demanded that I provide proof of address. So I sent them a letter from them. I sent them a letter that they'd sent to me to provide proof of address. Now, this nonsense goes on 1 million times a day up and down the country. Do you think any narco drug dealing terrorists are put off by this? All it does is annoy normal people and waste their time and waste everybody's money. It's time for a really radical rethink. Digital identity, I mean, I don't want to get sidetracked away from open banking, but the role of digital identity in real AML can't be understated, because you're right. We cannot spend our way out of this problem. We need reg tech. And if you have a situation that we have now, where you try to erect these walls to keep the bad guys out, and then you make people fill out suspicious transaction reports on what's going on inside, you're absolutely doomed. We can see that already. What we should be doing instead is not having those barriers. We shouldn't have let everybody into the system so that we can find out what they're doing. If they're not in the system, we don't know what they're doing.
Dave,
if they're in the system, we have artificial intelligence, machine learning, databases. We can deep mine the hell out of them. We can do all sorts of clever stuff. But we need
love it. But I gotta, Cash, I want to punch it back to you for a finishing comment here, because we're running out of time, and I want you to again. No, Dave. Listen, this is wonderful.
Well, she makes me think about interesting things, you know.
So, Cash, I want you to help us tell us what we need to do moving forward. This is me asking you to tell us how we get Canada with I don't know how many different regulators who will have a say in our moving forward in digital identity, and governments and organizations. How do we harness the collective vested interests for the benefit of Canada to get moving on digital identity implementation in this country? What are the key things we need to focus on?
Okay, so I think the first big thing is I think the government has done a bang-up job as of late. The Ministry of Finance coming out with their DOF, with the consultations that are underway, amazing. The recently proposed Bill C-11 and prioritizing digital privacy, another like big win for us. And I think those are all steps in the right direction. Other things that I think we could make a bit more real, we need to have really strong value propositions for like consumers and businesses. We want to make sure that consumer adoption happens. This whole idea of consumers even knowing what open banking is, like nobody knows what open banking is. Nobody knows what digital ID is or what open finance is. They don't know what any of that stuff is. They know that they're looking for value, and how we develop that value for them is based on making all these means available to them. So that's probably the first thing.
Really strong use cases. Really strong use cases.
You need to make sure the experience is solid in terms of the users that will drive adoption. We need to make sure that the systems are solid so that there's no performance issues. You need to make sure that there's commercial balance between commercialization and risk, and that all players, whether you're big, whether you're small, you all are kind of balanced, but also that you have an incentive to want to play in the space. And then you got to make sure that there's a whole bunch of rules that are in place, that everybody plays by the same set of rules. Those are kind of key things. I think it's really not anything about open banking or payment initiation or digital ID, because if you're a regular Canadian, nobody knows what any of that stuff means. But what we all do know is that there's this blurring of lines that is happening across industries. There's this blurring of lines that's happening between participants, those that were traditionally in payments and financial services. That when you look at the list of competitors and organizations that are, you know, that you could work collectively with, that list is really big now. And as an ecosystem, what I think we need to do is actually make sure that we are all prepared for the various scenarios that could unfold for us, so that no one is left behind through unintended consequences. And then the other thing is, as an ecosystem, we can't just be bystanders watching this stuff unfold. The onus is on us to actually convene the right people. And so Senator Deacon, we've spoken about this. Interac, for example, and we're looking to establish a minimum viable ecosystem to help drive this forward, because the proof is in the pudding. Let's actually do the work, and ton of assumptions when we're all doing this stuff independently. But let's actually validate or refute some of those assumptions, and then figure out what an open banking framework should be in Canada that's fit for purpose for us here in Canada.
I love it. And it just, that minimum viable ecosystem is such an important concept that you keep raising it. How do we get started? And how do we make sure? I'll tell you the thing that shifted in is we hand it back to Michelle, and I got to tell you, Michelle, I've just loved this conversation. It's been fantastic. But when I look at what caused the Senate Standing Committee on Banking, Trade, and Commerce to go from, I don't know, I'm not sure about this. I'm not really confident about this open banking thing, to go, oh wow, this is an urgent priority. It's about underbanked and unbanked Canadians. It's about marginalized groups not getting access to credit, not getting access to banking services, not being able to fulfill their potential because the current system isn't working for them. And the opportunity is so obvious as we move down the road to consumer-directed finance. So that's what shifted us. I'm really glad you keep focusing us back in that point. Dave, Birch, Cash, I've just loved this conversation. Michelle, and I know you've got a couple more questions to ask as we wrap up, but I got to tell you, thank you. I've been really grateful to be involved. Go ahead,
Oh, it's been
Michelle.
fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Such a just a passionate discussion on digital ID and giving consumers back the power, essentially. And though to David's point, the UK has had some challenges, open banking led the way to find those challenges and to shine light on the fact that digital ID is a crucial point that needs to have, like Cash said, that kind of tandem trajectory. It can't be put like, we can't just say digital ID needs to come first and open banking will come 5 to 10 years from now, because Canada won't have a leading opportunity on a global scale. I think it's so important to take the learnings from the UK and other places. And David, as we go to close off, and one thought, other than the UK, from a digital ID perspective, where can Canada lean to look to see where some great structures have been enabled? And then Cash, I'll ask my last question to you.
That's a really interesting question, Michelle. I mean, right now, I tend to spend a lot of time, for a variety of reasons, I spend a lot of time looking at New Zealand, because New Zealand is so Australia opted to have a sort of framework-based approach, more detailed than PCTF, but the same kind of idea. Within that, in the financial sector, they built the Trust ID framework, which is terrific. I mean, a very, very good piece of work. And in New Zealand, they're thinking about adopting something like that, but with a statutory footing. So in other words, you know, it will be a statutory requirement that you have to use a digital identity for access to certain circumstances, certain services. But rather than say you have to use a government ID or whatever, it will be, you have to use an ID from this framework. So that might be a government ID, it might be a bank ID, it might be some other ID, it doesn't matter. And to me, that seems to sort of strike the right balance. So if I had to pick one place, oddly, right now, it would be New Zealand, actually.
Thank you for that insight, because I haven't heard many people speak of New Zealand. And I think it brings a lot of ideas to the forefront of people needing to do some research and really grasp that as we take our leap forward. It's like we've got running shoes, we just haven't put them on yet. And I'm very much hoping that these sessions and everything that's happening in Canada at the moment helps us push towards that. So thank you, David, for that insight. And Cash, from a last question perspective, you know, with Interac purchasing 2 keys and then DIAC initiating their first testing of the National Trust Framework, that next step to really get us on the roadmap, because I think the question from a lot of people is, you know, is open banking, are we on the verge of open banking? Open banking, like the cat's out of the bag, we've got to do it. But I think the challenge from government is they really do need industry-led insights because we have more of a global perspective. So, you know, as we run now, like just give us that one thought with all the insights that Interac has and how much trajectory of growth you guys have had this year of new services people are utilizing because they're so digitally focused. Having that 2 keys insight, how do we really get there quickly?
I think that it's not any single thing that will help actually move the needle on any of this stuff. There are, at Interac specifically, we're looking at all 3 things. We're looking at the payments initiation piece of work, we're looking at the digital ID piece of work, and we're looking at the open banking piece of work. We as an organization are very focused on understanding how they all will come together and intersect, and having that line of sight while working on the 3 streams independently will actually help, almost like look at it as like a 1 + 1 = 3. That's how we're looking at it. So how do these 3 things actually help support each other for like greater impact to Canadians?
No, that's such a great point, because I think having that long-term roadmap, whether it be 3 roadmaps that come into one, we need to give that kind of high-level vision to push this all forward. So thank you so much for everyone's insights today. I'm excited to share this with the world and hope that we get some insights for New Zealand in the future as we go to run forth.
Thanks, Michelle.